At 10:30 a.m. on the 11th of November 1926, the American Association of State Highway Officials voted to add U.S. Highway 66 to the national highway system. The vote was taken in Chicago at the Edgewater Beach Hotel. A representative from Oklahoma named Cyrus Avery had spent years lobbying for this route. He wanted a diagonal highway that would connect Chicago to Los Angeles, cutting through the heart of the country. The motion passed without debate. The number 66 was assigned. Everything seemed normal. Only a few months later, something was off. The road that had been approved did not yet exist. Sections of it were unpaved. Some sections were not even surveyed. The highway was a promise written on paper waiting to become real. What happened? The highway was supposed to be a straightforward connection between major cities, but the geography of the American West was not straightforward. The route crossed deserts, mountains, and plains. It passed through small towns that had no paved roads at all. When the route was first opened to travelers in 1927, drivers had to navigate gravel, dirt, and sometimes just tire tracks in the sand. The first person to drive the entire length of Route 66 from Chicago to Los Angeles was a man named John T. Woodruff. He completed the trip in 1927, but he reported that large sections of the road were barely passable. He got stuck in mud. He had to ask for help from farmers. He slept in his car. The highway was open, but it was not finished. Cyrus Avery was a businessman from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He had been appointed to the Oklahoma State Highway Commission in 1923. He believed that a diagonal highway running from the Midwest to the West Coast would open up the interior of the country for commerce and travel. At the time, most U.S. highways ran north-south. Avery wanted something different. He argued that a diagonal route would follow the path of the Santa Fe Trail, one of the oldest trade routes in American history. The trail had been used by explorers, traders, and settlers for centuries. Avery saw his highway as a continuation of that tradition. He called it the Main Street of America. The highway was completed in stages. The first sections were paved in the late 1920s. By 1930, most of the route was drivable, but it was not uniform. Some states had better roads than others. California had paved most of its section quickly. Arizona and New Mexico struggled with funding. Oklahoma and Texas had stretches of concrete, but also long sections of gravel. The road was inconsistent. Drivers never knew what to expect. In 1930, the population of the United States was about 123 million. Most Americans did not own cars. Long-distance road trips were unusual. Route 66 was used primarily by local traffic and cross-country trucking. It was not yet a cultural symbol, it was just a road. The first major test of Route 66 came in the 1930s. The Great Depression had begun in 1929. By 1932, unemployment in the United States had reached 23%. The Dust Bowl began in 1934. A severe drought hit the Great Plains. The soil dried up. Winds picked up the topsoil and carried it in massive dark clouds across the country. The worst affected areas were in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. These were the states that Route 66 passed through. In 1934, the first of what would become hundreds of thousands of Dust Bowl refugees began moving along Route 66. They loaded their belongings onto trucks, cars, and wagons. They left behind homes, farms, and entire communities. They were going to California. The rumor was that California had work. The rumor was that the land was green. The rumor was that you could survive there. At 8 a.m. on the 15th of March 1935, a convoy of 50 vehicles passed through the town of Shamrock, Texas on Route 66. The vehicles were packed with families. They were heading west. The local gas station owner counted them. He had never seen so many cars in one day. Everything seemed normal. Only a few weeks later, something was off. The number of vehicles passing through Shamrock increased to hundreds per day. The town was not prepared. There was not enough fuel. There was not enough food. The migrants were exhausted. They were desperate. What happened? The Dust Bowl was caused by a combination of drought and poor farming practices. The Great Plains had been overfarmed for decades. The soil had been stripped of its protective grass cover. When the rain stopped, the soil turned to dust. The winds did the rest. The Dust Bowl affected an area of about 100 million acres. It displaced an estimated 2.5 million people between 1930 and 1940. Of those, about 400,000 traveled to California. Most of them used Route 66. The migrants were not just farmers. They were shopkeepers, mechanics, teachers, and factory workers. They were entire communities. They brought their cultures, their skills, and their desperation with them. They traveled in overloaded vehicles that broke down frequently. They camped by the side of the road. They cooked over open fires. They slept on the ground. They were helped by local communities along the route, but resources were scarce. The California Division of Immigration and Housing set up checkpoints at the Arizona-California border. A relief worker named Tom Collins was assigned to count the migrants and assess their needs. In 1935, Collins reported that between 1,500 and 2,000 families were entering California every month via Route 66. He said they were in poor condition. They had little money. They had no place to go. Collins tried to help. He set up tent camps. He distributed food and water, but the numbers were overwhelming. The migrants were not welcomed in California. Local residents called them Okies, a derogatory term that was applied to anyone from the Dust Bowl region regardless of their actual state of origin. The California government tried to close the border. In 1936, the state passed a law that made it illegal to bring an indigent person into California. The law was challenged and overturned, but the hostility remained. John Steinbeck wrote about the migration in his 1939 novel The Grapes of Wrath. The novel followed the Joad family as they traveled from Oklahoma to California on Route 66. Steinbeck described the highway as a path of hope and despair. He called it the Mother Road. The name stuck. The Dust Bowl migration transformed Route 66 from a regional highway into a national symbol. It became the road of the displaced, the road of the desperate, the road of the hopeful. It was the route that people took when they had nothing left to lose. In 1941, the United States entered World War II. Route 66 became a military highway. Convoys of trucks and troops moved along its length. Military bases in the Southwest were connected to supply lines in the Midwest. The highway was improved, sections were widened, bridges were reinforced, the pavement was replaced. After the war, Route 66 became a tourist highway. Soldiers who had traveled the road during the war returned with their families. They drove west to see the Grand Canyon, the Petrified Forest, the Painted Desert, the Mojave Desert. They stopped at roadside attractions. They ate at diners. They slept in motels. Route 66 became synonymous with the American road trip. In 1950, the population of the United States was about 151 million. Car ownership was increasing. Gasoline was cheap. The interstate highway system did not yet exist. Route 66 was the fastest and most direct route from the Midwest to the West Coast. It was busy. At 10 a.m. on the 29th of June, 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. Act authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways. It was the largest public works project in American history. Everything seemed normal. Only a few years later, something was off. The interstate system was designed to bypass towns. It was designed for speed. Route 66 was not fast enough. Towns along the highway began to die. What happened? The interstate system was built for the Cold War. Eisenhower had seen the German Autobahn during World War II. He believed that the United States needed a similar system for military mobility. The interstates were built to connect major cities. They were built to be straight and fast. They bypassed the small towns that had grown along Route 66. Traffic on Route 66 decreased. The businesses that had depended on travelers closed. The motels emptied. The diners shut down. The gas stations went out of business. In 1960, the first section of Interstate 40 was opened in Oklahoma. It paralleled Route 66. Drivers chose the new highway because it was faster and safer. In 1964, Interstate 44 was opened in Missouri. It bypassed Springfield, a major stop on Route 66. In 1968, Interstate 40 was extended into Texas. It bypassed Amarillo. In 1970, Interstate 15 was completed in California. It bypassed Barstow, the last major stop on Route 66 before Los Angeles. The decline was not immediate. It took decades, but it was relentless. By 1980, most of Route 66 had been bypassed or abandoned. The sections that remained were local roads. They were not maintained. They were not marked. The highway was disappearing. In 1984, the last section of original Route 66 pavement was replaced by Interstate 40 in Arizona. The section was near the town of Williams. The old road was abandoned. It was left to crack and fade. The official end came on the 27th of June 1985. The American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials voted to remove Route 66 from the national highway system. The vote was unanimous. The highway was no longer a U.S. highway. The signs were taken down. The road was gone from the official map. But something strange happened. People began to look for the old road. They found it, they drove it, they took photographs, they formed preservation societies. In 1990, the Route 66 Association of Missouri was founded. Other states followed. In 1999, the National Park Service launched a program called Route 66, Discover Our Shared Heritage. The program identified historic sites along the route. In 2000, the U.S. Congress passed the Route 66 Preservation Act. The act allocated funds for the restoration and maintenance of the highway. Why did people care? Route 66 had become a symbol. It was the road of the Dust Bowl, the road of the road trip, the road of the American dream. It was the place where people went when they were running towards something or running away from something. It was a physical reminder of a time when the journey mattered as much as the destination. The highway connected people to the past. It was a tangible link to the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, World War II, the post-war boom, the rise of the automobile, and the decline of small-town America. It was a road that had witnessed the full arc of the 20th century. Today, about 85% of the original Route 66 is still drivable. The sections that remain are preserved as historic routes. They are marked with brown and white signs. They are maintained by state and local governments. Tourists from around the world come to drive the road. They come to see the diners, the motels, the gas stations, the neon signs. They come to experience what remains. But the road is not just a tourist attraction. It is a living document. It shows what America was and what it could become. It is a road that was built by hand, paved by sweat, and driven by hope. How could a road that was officially decommissioned in 1985 still feel like the soul of America? The answer is in the stories. Every mile of Route 66 has a story. The story of a family that packed everything into a truck and drove west. The story of a soldier who came home from war and drove west to start a new life. The story of a young couple who drove west in search of adventure. The story of a truck driver who drove the highway when it was the only road. Route 66 is not a road anymore. It is a memory. It is a collection of memories. And those memories still matter. The dust settles, the pavement cracks, the signs fade, but the road does not disappear. At 2:15 p.m. on the 15th of July 1992, a man named Michael Wallace pulled his vintage Chevrolet onto a stretch of old Route 66 near Amboy, California. He had driven from Chicago following maps that showed the highway as a dotted line. He wanted to see the road before it was gone. He found a stretch of two-lane asphalt that had not been resurfaced in decades. There were no other cars, there was no sound except the wind. Wallace got out and took a photograph of the cracked pavement stretching toward a distant mountain. He later said that the photograph became famous. Everything seemed normal. Only a few years later something was off. The photograph appeared in magazines, travel guides, and online forums. It became a symbol of a road that would not stay forgotten. What happened? Wallace was not a professional photographer. He was an engineer from Illinois. He had grown up hearing stories about the mother road from his father who had driven it in 1947. When his father died, Wallace decided to trace the journey. He found sections that were barely drivable. He found towns that had been erased from the map. He also found people who still lived along the road. They told him stories about the Dust Bowl, about the war, about the tourists who used to stop. They told him that the road was not dead, it was just waiting. The photograph that Wallace took near Amboy became a rallying point. People saw it and wanted to see the road themselves. In 1993, the first organized Route 66 Preservation Conference was held in Springfield, Missouri. It was organized by the National Park Service and the Route 66 Association of Missouri. The conference brought together historians, community leaders, and former highway workers. They discussed how to save what remained. They mapped the surviving sections. They identified historic diners, motels, and gas stations. They asked the question, how could a road that had been taken off the map still be worth saving? The answer was in the numbers. By 1994, the number of foreign tourists visiting Route 66 was growing. Travelers from Germany, Japan, Australia, and the United Kingdom were renting cars and driving the route. They had seen the road in movies like The Grapes of Wrath and Easy Rider. They had heard it in songs by Chuck Berry and the Rolling Stones. They wanted to drive the same pavement that had carried the American dream. The tourism dollars began to flow back into the small towns that had been dying for decades, but the road was not easy to drive. In 1995, a group of German tourists got lost near the town of Glen Rio, New Mexico. Glen Rio was a ghost town. It had been a stop on Route 66 in the 1940s, but the interstate bypassed it in 1968. The gas station was boarded up. The motel was collapsing. The tourists had no cell phone service. They waited for hours until a local rancher found them. The rancher told them that the road was still being used, but mostly by people who knew it well. He said that the people who lived along the old highway kept the road open out of pride. They did not want it to disappear. What did the rancher mean? Pride. Route 66 had been built by local labor. The highway had been a source of work during the Great Depression. The people who lived along it remembered that. They remembered the dust, the heat, the gravel, the tar. They remembered the day the pavement was laid. They remembered the first car that drove on it. They did not want that memory to be erased by asphalt and concrete. They started maintaining the road themselves. They patched potholes, they cleared debris, they put up signs. They did it without government funding. They did it because the road was theirs. In 1996, the National Park Service published a report titled Route 66, An Administrative History. The report documented the highway's construction, its heyday, its decline, and its rebirth as a historic route. The report concluded that Route 66 was not just a road, it was a linear cultural landscape. It represented the movement of people, the exchange of ideas, and the transformation of the American West. The report recommended that the highway be preserved as a historic corridor. In 1997, the Route 66 Preservation Act was introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives. The bill was sponsored by Congressman George Miller of California. Miller had grown up near Route 66 in the 1950s. He remembered the neon signs and the drive-in theaters. The bill allocated federal funds to help states preserve the remaining sections of the highway. The bill passed in 1999 and was signed into law in 2010. The funds were small, but the message was clear. The federal government was acknowledging that Route 66 was worth saving, but the government could not save every mile. In 2001, the town of Baxter Springs, Kansas lost its last operating Route 66 motel. The motel had been built in 1932. It had housed Dust Bowl refugees, soldiers, and tourists. It had closed in 1998. The building was torn down to make way for a parking lot. The local historical society tried to stop the demolition, but they did not have the money to buy the property. The site was paved over. The motel was gone. How could a place that had survived the Depression, the war, and the interstate system be lost to a parking lot? The answer was in the economics. The preservation funds were not enough to buy every historic building. Many properties were privately owned. Owners could sell to developers. They could demolish and build something new. Preservation movement could not stop all the changes. It could only slow them down. At 8 a.m. on the 3rd of April 2002, a fire broke out in the Blue Swallow Motel in Tucumcari, New Mexico. The motel was a Route 66 landmark. It had been built in 1956. It had a neon sign shaped like a blue swallow. The fire started in the kitchen of the owner's apartment. The fire department arrived quickly. They contained the blaze. The building was damaged but not destroyed. The owner, a woman named Linda, said the motel would reopen. It did. The Blue Swallow Motel is still operating today. It is one of the few remaining original Route 66 motels that still has a neon sign and a working swimming pool. The fire was a wake-up call. The preservation movement realized that the remaining landmarks were fragile. They could be lost in minutes. They could be lost to fire, to weather, to neglect, to development. The movement shifted from documentation to direct action. Volunteers began to paint, repair, and rebuild. In 2004, a group of volunteers in Oklahoma restored the Rock Cafe in Stroud. The cafe had been built in 1939. It had been closed for years. The volunteers cleaned the kitchen, repainted the walls, and fixed the roof. They reopened the cafe. They served burgers and shakes on the original counter. The cafe is still open today. It is a favorite stop for Route 66 travelers. In 2005, the Route 66 Association of Illinois launched a program to install interpretive signs at historic sites along the highway. The signs told the story of each location. They included photographs and maps. They explained why the site mattered. The program was funded by the Illinois Department of Transportation and the National Park Service. It became a model for other states. In 2006, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization UNESCO added Route 66 to its list of tentative World Heritage Sites. The decision did not grant immediate protection, but it signaled that the road was internationally recognized as a cultural landscape. The road was no longer just an American highway. It was a global icon, yet the road continued to face challenges. In 2008, a section of Route 66 in Oklahoma was washed out by a flash flood. The road was closed for months. The state considered not repairing it. The local community protested. They argued that the road was essential for tourism. The state eventually repaired it. The road reopened in 2009. In 2010, a study by the University of New Mexico found that Route 66 tourism generated about $60 million annually for the state of New Mexico. The study also found that most of the tourists were from outside the United States. They came from Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom. They stayed in motels, ate in diners, and bought souvenirs. The study concluded that preserving Route 66 was not just about history, it was about economics, but the economic benefits were uneven. The towns that had been bypassed by the interstate saw some revival, but the revival was limited. Many old buildings were still vacant. Many lots were still empty. The road could not bring back all the jobs, all the families, all the hope. It could only bring a trickle of visitors. In 2012, the National Park Service launched an interactive website called Route 66, Discover Our Shared Heritage. The website allowed users to explore the road virtually. It included oral histories, photographs, and maps. It also included a section called What Can I Do to Help? The section listed ways to support preservation, including donating money, volunteering time, and visiting the road. The website was popular. It received millions of hits in the first year. In 2014, a group of filmmakers released a documentary called Route 66, The Untold Story. The documentary interviewed people who had lived along the road in the 193s and 194s. One woman, who was 92 years old, remembered walking from Oklahoma to California with her family. She said that the road was not paved when they walked it. It was dirt. She said that they had to stop and rest every few miles. She said that they met other families along the way. They shared food, water, and stories. She said that the road was the only thing that connected them to a future. The documentary also interviewed a man who had worked as a mechanic on Route 66 in the 195s. He said that he fixed cars for people who were going west. He said that he saw thousands of cars. He remembered one family whose car broke down outside his garage. They had no money. He fixed the car for free. He gave them gas. He said that they cried. He said that he never saw them again. He said that was what Route 66 was like. It was a road where strangers helped strangers. In 2015, the U.S. Congress passed the Route 66 Centennial Commission Act. The act established a commission to plan the centennial celebration of Route 66 in 2026. The commission was made up of members from each state that the road passed through. The commission was tasked with promoting the road, raising funds for preservation, and organizing events. The commission began working in 2006. In 2017, a severe storm in Arizona damaged a section of Route 66 near the town of Seligman. The storm caused mudslides that buried the road under several feet of debris. The road was closed for 6 months. The Arizona Department of Transportation considered whether to repair the road or let it remain closed. The decision was not easy. The road was used mostly by tourists. It was not a major transportation route, but the road was a symbol. The state decided to repair it. The road reopened in 2008. In 2019, a survey by the Route 66 Association of New Mexico found that over 90% of the road's original length in the state was still drivable. That was good news. But the survey also found that many of the original bridges, culverts, and drainage systems were deteriorating. They needed repairs that were expensive. The survey estimated that it would cost about $20 million to bring the road up to modern standards while preserving its historic character. That money was not available. How could a road that was officially decommissioned in 1985 still require millions of dollars in maintenance? The answer was that the road was not officially maintained as a highway. It was maintained as a historic route. The maintenance funding came from state and local budgets, which were limited. The road was not a priority for federal highway dollars. It was a priority only for the people who lived along it and the people who loved it. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States. Travel ground to a halt. Tourists stopped coming to Route 66. Motels closed, diners shut down, gas stations went empty, the road was quiet. The preservation movement worried that the road would not survive the economic downturn, but something unexpected happened. At 10:30 a.m. on the 5th of July 2020, a woman named Angela Ruiz pulled her car into the parking lot of the Midpoint Cafe in Adrian, Texas. The Midpoint Cafe was exactly halfway between Chicago and Los Angeles on Route 66. It had been open since one night. Angela Ruiz was not a tourist. She lived in Amarillo, about 50 miles away. She had heard that the cafe was struggling. She decided to buy a hamburger. She posted a picture of the hamburger on social media. The picture went viral. People started to share it. They started to say that they would go to the cafe too. By the end of the week, the cafe had sold out of food. They had to hire more staff. The cafe survived the pandemic. That story repeated itself along the road. People who lived nearby began to support the local businesses. They drove out to the old motels and diners. They bought souvenirs. They told their friends. The businesses survived not because of international tourism, but because of local support. The road was not dead, it was adapting. In 2021, the Route 66 Centennial Commission held its first major event. The event was a virtual conference. It was attended by people from 40 countries. They discussed the future of the road. They talked about sustainability, about electric vehicle charging stations, about climate change. They talked about how the road could be preserved for the next 100 years. The conference ended with a question: what does Route 66 mean to you? The answers were varied. Some said it meant freedom, some said it meant adventure, some said it meant survival, some said it meant home. The road meant different things to different people, but it meant something to all of them. In 2022, a group of historians and geographers published a study in the Journal of Cultural Geography. The study examined the representation of Route 66 in travel literature from 1990 to 2010. The study found that the road was often described as the soul of America or the last great American road. The study noted that the descriptions were romanticized. They ignored the poverty, the racism, and the environmental damage that had also been part of the road's history. But the study also noted that the romanticization was not entirely false. The road had provided hope to millions. It had connected people. It had been a stage for the American drama. In 2023, a new section of Route 66 was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The section was in the Mojave Desert near Barstow, California. It was a 10-mile stretch of original pavement that had never been repaved. The road had cracks, potholes, and patches. It was rough, but it was authentic. The National Park Service said that the road was an example of early highway engineering. It said that the road should be preserved as a historic artifact. The state of California agreed. They put up signs that said Historic Route 66 Original Pavement, Drive at Your Own Risk. The road became a popular destination for photographers. At 5:47 p.m. on the 12th of September 2024, a couple from Japan stood on the side of that road. They had traveled from Tokyo to see the pavement. They had rented a car. They had driven from Los Angeles. They took pictures of the cracked asphalt. They looked at the mountains in the distance. They said that the road felt older and more alive than they had expected. They said that it was not just a road, it was a place where time had stopped. What did they mean? They meant that the road had not been erased, it had not been replaced, it had been left, it had become a relic, and relics have power. They remind us of what was, they make us ask what is. They give us a chance to see the past with our own eyes. The road does not disappear, it remains, it waits, it cracks and fades, but it does not disappear. Tonight, somewhere along the old alignment, a neon sign flickers on, a diner opens for breakfast. A car pulls into a parking lot, the driver steps out, he looks at the road, he does not know where it ends, he does not care. He is here on the mother road, the soul of America, still alive, still waiting, still moving. At 2:14 a.m. on the 27th of October 2023, a fire alarm activated at the Blue Swallow Motel in Tucumcari, New Mexico. The motel was one of the oldest continuously operating motor courts on Route 66. It had been open since 1939. The fire started in the utility room near the office. The flames spread quickly through the wooden ceiling. The Tucumcari Fire Department arrived within 8 minutes. They evacuated the guests. 5 rooms were occupied. Everyone got out. The fire was contained to the office and 2 adjacent rooms, but the smoke damage extended through the entire building. The motel closed indefinitely. The owner at the time was a man named Kevin and his wife Nancy. They had purchased the motel in Tucumcari. They had spent years restoring the neon sign, the vintage furniture, the original tile. The Blue Swallow was famous for its neon sign, a blue swallow bird in flight glowing against the New Mexico night sky. The sign survived the fire. The building did not. What happened? The investigation by the New Mexico State Fire Marshal's office took 2 weeks. They determined the cause, an electrical fault in a breaker panel that had been installed in 1985. The panel was outdated. The wiring was frayed. The motel had passed its most recent fire inspection, but the inspector had not looked inside the panel. The fire marshals recommended that all historic motels on Route 66 review their electrical systems. The recommendation was not a mandate. There was no funding for inspections. The Blue Swallow closure became a symbol of the fragility of preservation. In the weeks that followed, the Route 66 Association of New Mexico launched a fundraising campaign. They raised $87,000. The insurance payout was only $200,000. The total cost of restoration was estimated at $1.2 million. Kevin and Nancy faced a choice. They could sell the land to a developer who wanted to build a gas station, or they could try to rebuild. They chose to rebuild. By March of 2024, the restoration was underway. Workers stripped the burned sections. They salvaged original tiles and windows. They replaced the electrical system with modern wiring. The neon sign was sent to a restoration shop in Tulsa. The sign had been damaged by heat, but the glass tubes were intact. The technician said that the sign was a work of art. He said that the Blue Swallow was the symbol of the road. He said that it had to be saved. At 10 a.m. on the 15th of June 2024, the Blue Swallow Motel reopened. Kevin and Nancy held a ceremony. Guests from as far away as Australia attended. They cut a ribbon. The neon sign was lit. The Blue Swallow glowed again. The motel had 32 rooms. 19 were sold out that night. The revenue covered one night's mortgage payment. The road continued. But the fire raised a deeper question. How many other historic motels along Route 66 were at risk of the same fate? The answer was not known. A survey conducted by the National Park Service in 2022 had identified 423 historic motels on the road. Of those, only 160 were still operating. The rest had been abandoned, demolished, or converted into other uses. The operating motels were mostly owned by individuals or small families. They lacked the capital for expensive upgrades. The electrical systems in many were original or from the 1950s. The fire codes were inconsistent. Each state had its own regulations. Some states exempted historic properties from modern codes, others did not. In 2021, a study by the University of New Mexico found that the average age of a Route 66 motel owner was 67. Many owners had no succession plan. When they retired or died, the motel often closed. The road was losing its landmarks one by one. At 4:30 p.m. on the 22nd of August 2024, a man named Harold Johnson parked his pickup truck in front of the remains of the El Vado Motel in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The El Vado had been built in 1937. It was a classic Pueblo Revival-style motor court with 2 stories and a central courtyard. It had been closed since 2005. The property was purchased by a developer in 2019. The developer planned to demolish it and build a luxury apartment complex. The city of Albuquerque had granted a demolition permit in 2010, but preservationists had filed a lawsuit. The lawsuit argued that the motel was eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. The court agreed in 2020. The demolition was halted, but the building had already been gutted. The windows were boarded. The courtyard was overgrown. The neon sign was missing. It had been stolen in 2008. Harold Johnson had worked at the El Vado as a maintenance man in the 1970s. He had returned to see it one last time. He said that the motel was a ghost. He said that the road was full of ghosts. The legal battle over the El Vado continued into 2008. The developer appealed the court's decision. The state's Historic Preservation Office sided with the developer, arguing that the motel had lost its integrity. The building was too damaged to restore. The preservationists countered that the structure itself was sound, only the interior needed work. The case was scheduled for the New Mexico Supreme Court in early 2005. No one knew how it would end. How could a building that was a symbol of Route 66 be in such a state? The answer was time and neglect. The El Vado had been operational until 2005. After that, the owner allowed it to deteriorate. The roof leaked. The plumbing failed. The windows broke. When the sale happened, the building was already in poor condition. The developer saw an opportunity. The preservationists saw a loss. The court saw a legal argument. The road saw another piece of itself disappear. At 8:15 a.m. on the 3rd of September 2024, a freight train derailed near the town of Kingman, Arizona. The tracks ran parallel to a section of Route 66 that had been realigned in 195 The derailment occurred at a curve where the train was traveling at 60 miles per hour. The lead locomotive and 3 cars tipped over. The train was carrying mixed freight including lumber and rolls of steel. No hazardous materials were released. No one was injured. The derailment caused a closure of the railroad, but more importantly, it blocked the adjacent highway. A detour was set up through a dirt road that was originally the 1910 alignment of the National Old Trails Highway. That dirt road was later part of Route 66 before the 1954 realignment. Traffic backed up for miles. Local residents used the backup to sell water and snacks. One woman set up a table with homemade tamales. She sold out in 3 hours. The detour lasted 4 days. The derailment was investigated by the Federal Railroad Administration. They found that the track had been inspected 22 days earlier. The inspection had noted a minor defect in the rail joint. The inspector had flagged it for repair within 30 days. The repair was not completed. The derailment was caused by that defect. The railroad company was fined $50,000. The fine was less than the cost of the repair. The system had failed. But the derailment also showed something else. The old alignment, the dirt road that had been the original Route 66, was still there. It was still used by locals. It was still functional. The road did not forget its origins. At 2:30 p.m. on the 21st of September 2024, a woman named Maria Cruz pulled her SUV to the side of that dirt road. She was driving with her 12-year-old son. They were on a road trip from Los Angeles to Chicago. They had deliberately taken the old alignment. Maria wanted to show her son the road her grandfather had taken in 195. Her grandfather had moved the family from Missouri to California during the Dust Bowl migration. He had driven a 1937 Ford pickup along the dirt road that became Route 66. Maria had heard stories of the trip for her entire life. The family had struggled. They had run out of food. They had slept in the truck, but they had made it. Maria's son asked her why they were stopping. She pointed at a faded signpost. The signpost marked the location of a former gas station that had closed in 196. Only the concrete foundation remained. Weeds grew through the cracks. She told him that his great-grandfather had stopped here. He had bought a gallon of gas for 10 cents. He had cried because it was the last of his money. The gas station owner had seen the family and given them a free meal. That was Route 66, she said, a road of strangers helping strangers. The son took a photo. He posted it online. The photo showed the foundation, the weeds, the sky. Someone commented, "The road is still there, the people are gone, but the road remembers." At 7 a.m. on the 10th of October 2024, the Route 66 Centennial Commission held a press conference in Chicago. The commission announced that the centennial celebration would take place in 2026, exactly 100 years after the road was officially created. The plans included a network of events across all 8 states. There would be a parade of vintage vehicles. There would be concerts, art exhibitions, and literary readings. There would be a dedicated app that guided travelers along the remaining original alignments. The commission also announced that they had secured $25 million in federal funds for preservation projects. The funds would be distributed over 3 years, but the commission also acknowledged a problem. Many of the original sections of Route 66 were no longer publicly accessible. They had been paved over, built upon, or allowed to erode. In some places, the road was still owned by the state but had not been maintained for decades. The asphalt had cracked and crumbled. In others, the road had been sold to private landowners who had closed it. The commission could not force them to open it. One such section was near the town of Amboy, California. Amboy was a ghost town on Route 66. It had a famous landmark, the Roy's Motel and Cafe with its neon sign and gas station. The motel had been closed for years. The town was owned by a single individual who lived in New York. He had refused to sell. The road through Amboy was still drivable, but the pavement was almost gone. The commission considered whether to repair it. The owner said no. The road remained broken. At 11 a.m. on the 14th of October 2024, a group of volunteer preservationists under the name Route 66 Road Crew arrived at a site near Seligman, Arizona. They had organized a work day. They brought shovels, pickaxes, and gravel. They planned to fill potholes on a 2-mile section of original pavement that was used by tourists. The group included retirees, college students, and a few local business owners. They worked for 5 hours. They filled 23 potholes. They cleared debris from a drainage ditch. They planted a sign that read Historic Route 66 maintained by volunteers. One of the volunteers, a man named David Chen, had driven from Phoenix. He was a software engineer. He had never been on Route 66 before 2003. He had seen a documentary about the road and decided to help. He said that he worked on code all day. He said that fixing a road was different. It was physical. It was real. He could see the result. He said that the road needed people like him. It could not survive on nostalgia alone. By the end of the day, the group had raised enough money to cover the cost of gravel. The local hardware store gave a discount. The road crew planned to return next month. They posted updates on social media. They gained followers. The road was being saved one pothole at a time. At 5:45 p.m. on the 20th of October 2024, a meteorologist from the National Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm warning for a region of the Mojave Desert that included a section of Route 66 between Barstow and Ludlow. The storm was moving fast. It carried strong winds and hail. The road was not evacuated. There was no infrastructure for evacuation. The storm hit at 6:10 p.m. Hailstones the size of golf balls pounded the asphalt. The hail damaged several cars that were parked at a rest stop. The road surface was pitted. The storm lasted 20 minutes. When it cleared, the road was covered with a layer of ice and hail. The temperature dropped. The ice melted slowly. By morning, the road was clear, but the surface was rougher than before. The damage was cosmetic. No one was injured. The storm was a reminder that the road was not protected from nature. The elements would wear it down. The desert would reclaim it. The road was fighting a losing battle against time, but the road had always been fighting. It had been built by hand. It had been maintained with ingenuity. It had survived neglect, indifference, and abandonment. It had survived the interstate system. It had survived economic decline. It had survived storms and fires. The road was still there. At 8 a.m. on the 1st of November 2024, a couple from England arrived at the start of the route in Chicago. They stood at the intersection of Jackson Boulevard and Michigan Avenue. That intersection was the official eastern terminus. They took a photograph. They were starting a 3-week trip. They planned to drive the entire length using only the original alignments where possible. They had plotted a route that zigzagged through the states. They had prepared for rough roads, closed sections, and detours. They knew that the road was not a continuous highway. It was a collection of fragments. They drove out of Chicago. They passed through Joliet, Normal, and Springfield. They stopped at the Gemini Giant in Wilmington, Illinois. The Gemini Giant was a 40-foot-tall fiberglass statue of a spaceman holding a Burger Chef hamburger. It had stood since 1967. The statue was cracked and faded. The couple took a selfie. The giant looked down at them with blank eyes. The road continued. At 2 p.m. on the 2nd of November, they reached the Chain of Rocks Bridge near St. Louis. The bridge was a historic steel structure that crossed the Mississippi River. It had been part of Route 66 from 1936 to 1965. The bridge was closed to vehicles in 1968. It had been converted into a pedestrian and bicycle path in 1999. The couple parked nearby and walked across. The bridge had a curious feature, a sharp bend in the middle to avoid a rock formation. The river flowed beneath them. They could see the modern Interstate 270 bridge in the distance. The old road and the new road coexisted. The couple talked to a local guide who was leading a group across the bridge. The guide told them that the bridge had been scheduled for demolition in the 1990s. A group of volunteers saved it. The group raised money for restoration. The bridge now connects the Missouri state parks to the Illinois state parks. The guide said that the bridge was a symbol of the road. It crossed a river. It connected 2 states. It survived. By the time the couple reached Oklahoma, they had driven through rain, fog, and sun. They had passed abandoned gas stations and working diners. They had met people who remembered the road in its heyday. They had seen the cracked pavement of the original alignments and the smooth asphalt of the bypass sections. They had learned that the road was not a single road. It was 1,000 roads connected by memory. On the 5th of November, they stopped at the National Route 66 Museum in Elk City, Oklahoma. The museum was housed in a former highway patrol station. It contained exhibits on the history of the road, the Dust Bowl, the migrant workers, the roadside attractions, the neon signs. The museum curator, a woman named Linda Rhodes, had worked there for 30 years. She told the couple that the museum received 50,000 visitors a year. She said that most of the visitors were international. She said that they came because they had heard about the road in movies, books, or music. She said that the road was a myth. But it was a myth based on reality, she said. The road had carried people. It had built communities. It had given hope. It was not just a highway. It was a part of the American story, and the story was not over. The couple left the museum and continued west. They drove through Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. They arrived in Santa Monica on the 15th of November. They parked at the official western terminus, the intersection of Olympic and Lincoln Boulevards. The end of the road was marked by a small park with a plaque. They stood at the plaque. They looked at the Pacific Ocean. The sun was setting. The road was behind them. The man said that the road had not felt like it ended. It felt like it continued somewhere else. The woman agreed. She said that the road was a loop. You could turn around and drive back. The road was never finished. They turned around, they drove back to the motel, they planned to go home the next day, but the road stayed with them. At 9:30 p.m. on the 15th of November 2024, a documentary filmmaker named James Whittaker was editing footage in his apartment in Los Angeles. He was working on a feature-length documentary about the preservation of Route 66. He had been filming for 4 years. He had interviewed motel owners, museum curators, volunteers, and travelers. He had captured storms, fires, and reopenings. He had seen the road change. One of his final scenes was a shot of the Blue Swallow Motel after the fire. The neon sign was gone for repair. The building was dark, then he had a shot of the reopening. The sign was lit, the road was alive. He decided to end his film with that shot, the Blue Swallow flying in the dark, the road continuing. He closed his laptop. He looked at the clock. He thought about the road. He thought about the millions of people who had driven it. He thought about the millions more who would drive it. The road was not just a road. It was a bridge between past and future. It was a reminder that even when things fall apart, they can be rebuilt. At 6 a.m. on the 16th of November 2024, the sun rose over the Mojave Desert. It illuminated the cracked pavement of Route 66 near Goffs, California. A family of coyotes walked across the road. They left paw prints in the dust. The road was empty. The road was waiting. At 3:15 p.m. on the 17th of July, 1946, a 1936 Ford pickup truck loaded with household goods pulled into the U-Drop-In in Shamrock, Texas. The driver, a man named Harold Jenkins, had left Oklahoma City 3 days earlier with his wife, Alina, and their 2 children, ages 6 and 9. They were heading to California. They had $30 left. The truck was overheating. Steam rose from under the hood. Harold got out and opened the radiator cap. The coolant was nearly gone. He did not have money for repairs. He did not know anyone in Shamrock. The U-Drop-In was a gas station and restaurant built in 1936 in the Art Deco style. It served travelers on Route 66. The owner, John Nunn, saw the family standing by the truck. He walked over. He asked what was wrong. Harold explained. John looked at the radiator. He said the truck needed more than water. It needed a new hose. He had one in the back. He would install it for free. Harold said he could not pay. John said he did not ask for payment. He asked if the family had eaten. Alina said they had not eaten since breakfast. John told them to go inside. He would bring the food out. At 4 p.m., the family sat in the U-Drop-In. They ate hamburgers and drank soda. The children had ice cream. John refused to take any money. He said the road provided for those who provided for others. Harold asked how he could repay him. John said he could repay him by helping someone else on the road. That was the deal. By 5 p.m., the truck was fixed. The family drove west. They reached California 3 days later. Harold found work in a citrus grove. He never forgot the man in Shamrock. 40 years later, he wrote a letter to the U-Drop-In. The letter was framed and hung on the wall. It said that the kindness of a stranger on Route 66 had saved his family. What happened that day in Shamrock was not unusual. It was repeated thousands of times along the road. The U-Drop-In was one of many businesses that served as lifelines for travelers. The road was not just a highway. It was a network of human contact. People helped each other because they understood that everyone was passing through. The road demanded cooperation. It rewarded generosity. The U-Drop-In remained in operation for decades. It closed in the 1990s as traffic declined, but it was not demolished. In 2007, the town of Shamrock raised money to restore it. The building was repainted. The neon sign was relit. The U-Drop-In became a museum and a visitor center. Tourists stopped to take photographs. They read the letter from Harold Jenkins. They saw the old gas pumps. They imagined the families who had passed through. The U-Drop-In was restored because people remembered what it represented. It represented the idea that a stranger on a long road could become a friend. That idea was the soul of Route 66. By 6:30 p.m. on the 17th of July, 1946, Harold Jenkins and his family were somewhere in New Mexico. They did not know that they were part of a larger story. They were simply trying to survive, but the road recorded their passage. The road remembered. How did this system work? The road was not designed to be a social experiment. It was designed to move people from the Midwest to the West Coast. But in practice, it became a corridor of mutual aid. Gas stations offered water. Restaurants offered discounted meals. Motels offered credit to families who could not pay. The road created a culture of reciprocity. People who had been helped would help others. The road spread that habit. The Dust Bowl migration of the 193s had established this pattern. Farmers fleeing the drought traveled Route 66 in overloaded vehicles. They broke down. They ran out of food. They found that communities along the road had set up relief stations. In Oklahoma City, the city government opened a camp for migrants. In Amarillo, churches provided meals. In Gallup, local families took in travelers. The road was a safety net. After the war, the same spirit continued. Veterans returning from overseas traveled the road to start new lives. Families vacationed on the road. The businesses that served them were often family-run. The owners lived above the store. They knew their customers by name. They remembered the regulars. They celebrated the first-time visitors. The road became a place where people could be themselves. It was anonymous enough to allow freedom. It was intimate enough to foster connection. A traveler could stop at a diner and tell their life story to a stranger. The stranger would listen. The road did not judge. At 8 a.m. on the 18th of November 2024, a group of students from the University of Oklahoma arrived at the U-Drop-In. They were part of a history class studying the impact of Route 66 on American culture. They had driven from Norman in a van. They spent the morning photographing the building. They interviewed the curator. They learned about the restoration. One student asked the curator what the road meant to the town. The curator said it meant survival. Without Route 66, Shamrock might have become a ghost town. The road brought travelers money and stories. The road kept the town alive. The students then drove to the site of the old migrant camp in Oklahoma City. The camp was gone. It had been replaced by a shopping center. But a historical marker stood near the entrance. The marker described the camp as a place where thousands of displaced families found shelter. The students read the marker. They stood in silence. They tried to imagine the dust, the heat, the uncertainty. One student, a young woman named Alicia, said she did not understand how people could be so generous to strangers. The professor said that the road taught them that everyone was connected. The road was a line of human need, and need did not discriminate. The students returned to Norman that evening. They wrote essays about the trip. Many of them wrote about the U-Drop-In. They wrote about Harold Jenkins and John Nunn. They wrote about a letter that proved kindness outlasts concrete. The road was not just a road, it was a system of human decency. That system was fragile. It required people to act against their own self-interest, yet it worked. It worked because people believed that helping someone on the road was helping themselves. The road was a mirror. It showed what people were capable of when they chose to be good. At 10 p.m. on the 18th of November 2024, a driver named Maria Gonzalez was passing through Shamrock. She was heading east. She had driven from Los Angeles to visit her mother in Arkansas. She was tired. She saw the U-Drop-In sign lit. She pulled over. The museum was closed, but the parking lot was open. She sat in her car. She ate a sandwich. She looked at the building. She thought about the people who had stopped there 70 years ago. She thought about the families, the soldiers, the dreamers. She thought about how the road had carried them all. She started the engine. She drove east. The road was dark. Her headlights picked up the white line. She continued. The road was waiting for her just as it had waited for everyone else. At 9:15 a.m. on the 19th of November 2024, a historian named Dr. Samuel Torres stepped out of his truck at the side of a crumbling section of old Route 66 near Vega, Texas. He had driven from Lubbock the night before. He carried a camera, a notebook, and a GPS device. The pavement was cracked. Weeds grew through the asphalt. The original concrete slab from 1926 was visible in places. Dr. Torres had been documenting the surviving sections of the road for 8 years. He estimated that less than 20% of the original alignment remained intact. The rest had been paved over, abandoned, or reclaimed by the desert. Dr. Torres walked 100 yards along the old road. He photographed the surface. He noted the lack of guardrails. He recorded the coordinates. He stopped at a point where the road curved slightly to the north. He knelt down. He placed his hand on the concrete. He said the road was not just a relic. It was a record of movement. Every crack told a story of weather, weight, and time. He stood up. He looked west. The road disappeared into the horizon. He wondered how many families had passed this exact spot. How many of them had stopped? How many had continued? What Dr. Torres was doing was part of a larger effort to preserve the memory of Route 66 before it was gone completely. The National Park Service had established the Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program in 1999. It provided grants to restore historic buildings, bridges, and signs, but the program could not save every mile. Many sections lay on private land. They were plowed under or built over. The road that had once connected 2,000 miles of America was being erased, and yet people kept coming. Every year, thousands of international tourists rented cars and drove the remaining segments. They came from Germany, Japan, Australia, Brazil. They came because they had seen the road in movies, read about it in books, heard about it from grandparents. They wanted to experience a piece of America that no longer existed anywhere else. They wanted to feel the space, the silence, the isolation. They wanted to understand what it meant to cross a continent without an interstate. Dr. Torres returned to his truck. He drove another 10 miles east. He stopped at a gas station in Vega that had been operating since 1939. The owner, a man named Raymond Haskins, was 87 years old. He had taken over the station from his father in 1960. He still pumped gas for customers. He still cleaned windshields. He still asked where they were going. Raymond remembered the road when it was the main artery. He remembered when truckers slept in their cabs and diners served coffee for a nickel. He remembered when strangers helped strangers because they had no choice. He told Dr. Torres that the road was not dead. It was just quieter. People still needed it. They just did not know it yet. At 11:30 a.m., Dr. Torres sat in the station's office. He wrote in his notebook. He summarized what he had learned that morning. The road was disappearing, but the road was also being remembered. The balance between loss and memory was what gave Route 66 its weight. The road was not the soul of America because it was still intact. It was the soul because people refused to let it go. The road lived in photographs, postcards, stories, and dreams. It lived in the act of driving. It lived in every traveler who stopped at a gas station and asked for directions. It lived in the hands that held the wheel. Dr. Torres closed his notebook. He thanked Raymond. He walked out to his truck. He started the engine. He looked at the road ahead. He knew that somewhere someone was packing a suitcase, filling a tank, and setting out. The road was waiting. It had always been waiting.